and raise your hands. And Leah, where is the hand raising tool, just so we could tell them?
Okay,
Leah?
that's a good question. I can't really tell on my end. They might just have to enter things.
I think I remember it being in the bottom left when you're participating. You should see it. There's a little hand. And so that we're going to use that at times as well. I know a lot of webinars, people get on and they start checking their email. I've been there before, but I really like everyone to pay attention and try to be active participants in it, because it's going to help everyone, me learn and you guys at the same time. So please be as interactive as possible. I would like to know who's on the call through the chat, but first I wanted to go over some learning objectives. As Leah put out, as you saw, these are a few of what we'll be working on today. Learn how to identify what coalition products and initiatives you have that are most likely to generate new financial resources. Learn to successfully start thinking like a nonprofit business, and practice using a tool developed to assess your own coalition's budgets and activities. It would be easy for me just to be like, let's talk about how you guys can make money. But we would be missing huge parts of strategic planning in between. And so in order to get to the part where we could figure out what is happening in your nonprofit or in your coalition as a new way to generate revenue, we really have to start at the beginning, which is your budgets and what's working and not working. And I know it's a little controversial sometimes when I talk to people. Either some people are like, yes, you should run your nonprofit like a business, and other people are like, no, nonprofits aren't businesses, they're, to serve. And I agree with both. The fact is, it's a business with a heart. And when you look at a regular business, they're looking about cutting budgets and everything else because if both have a dollar, let's say a business and a nonprofit both have a dollar, the business is looking at multiplying that dollar to make the most profit. Well, a nonprofit is looking at multiplying that dollar in order to give more services to their community. And that's why it's so important for us to think like a business, is because we want to take that $1 we're given, whether it's from the federal government, the state, or a local organization, and really see how we can multiply that for its maximum benefit to help the people in the community that we're trying to help. And so that's why when I say start thinking like a nonprofit business, that's really what we're trying to get at. But in the end of this, if there's one thing you get out of it, I really truly hope that you look at your budgets this week and start thinking about them in a new way other than just spending them and making sure you stay on task with them, but really start looking at them as a tool to your strategic planning and how you can use them to build a more sustainable coalition or nonprofit business. And that hopefully immediately after this you have some new things on your to-do list that you could start doing differently in your coalition or your nonprofit to start moving forward. And I apologize. My lovely family gave me the flu and the cold to start 2017, so if you hear sniffling, that is me, but luckily you're on a webinar and you can't catch it. Kristina Merino, who's currently the Executive Director of the Coffee County Anti-Drug Coalition, was going to be on this webinar with me, but she was unable to make it today. She will be on part 2 next week. But as Leah so graciously announced me, I have been now with the coalition for 10 years. I've been with nonprofit work for 12 years. And so as though I love coalition, that's who I am. I have been a nonprofit person since the start, from everything from domestic violence work to work with at-home counseling for at-risk youth. So a little bit of everything. So even though I will talk a lot about coalition work because that's what I'm doing there, this is very easily relatable to what we're talking about in terms of nonprofit work in general. Making sure. Okay. So first things first, the art, or aka work of sustainability, it is hard. It is work. I think a lot of times people go into it thinking it will take one meeting, we'll get this plan out, and it really is a living product that we should be starting to talk about from the beginning. And there's a lot of ups and downs in it, and you're going to want to fall asleep and pass out like this poor little guy shows in this picture. But it's worth the work, and at the end of it, it truly is like what we do is art for coalitions, and that's what I feel like in nonprofit, because at the end when you do it right, it allows us to keep doing the work that we love doing. So as much as it's like tedious as we're doing it, once it's done, it provides us with such a foundation to continue the great work each of you are doing in your communities. So it's well worth the time and the effort and the hair pulling to just go ahead and start that process. Okay, so this is where I'm first going to ask you to use the chat. In your chat box, if you go ahead and rate yourself from 1 to 5, 1 being a newbie and 5 being to expert of how you feel about coalition work, or if you're a nonprofit, where you feel like you're in your non-profit career. If you feel like you're 1 a newbie, 5 an expert. And if you don't mind, if you go ahead and write what county you're with, if you're with a coalition, or if you're with a nonprofit, what nonprofit you're with. If you go ahead and do that in your chat box, please, because you love me and you want me to see people. Oh, thank you, Deborah. Jenny, I love your 1.75. Thank you guys so much for using the chat box. I appreciate that. Good. So we have a little bit of everywhere. Leah, how many people do we have on the line right now? Do you know?
We have 25.
Okay. We'll wait a few more minutes so I can see kind of who all's out there. And I'm calling out Angie Dickens, saying that she's a 3.5. She's being very nice. She's actually a 5. I'm redoing hers.
I can't see it. I don't know if I'm doing it right, Christina. I can't see everyone else. Do I not see everyone else's chat, or just I see mine?
I see yours. I don't know. Leah, should they be able to see everyone?
I thought they should be able to, but we see it from a different viewpoint. So honestly,
yeah, see, I just see down here at the bottom it says chat with presenter, and I can type in my question. That's all.
Oh, does it? It should let you select the. Does it let you select the recipient other than the presenter, like to everyone?
Nope.
It might not.
No, it just says chat with presenter.
Okay. So yes, I'm seeing. I'm sorry. So everyone, yeah, there's a lot of 1s to 3s, and like I said, some of you are being very humble, because I know you're much higher than that. And no one else sees everyone. Okay. So it is heavy. A lot of coalitions there. A lot of great new coalitions. So it's a good mix. So thank you all for using the chat. I sincerely appreciate it, because we'll need it as we go through. So moving on, if I can get there we go. So rooted in sustainability. And I love to use the tree with this, with the roots, and it takes me forever to find one I like, and I'm still not sure I like this one. But the reason it's important is because you're really beginning, you have to start from the bottom up. And now, even if you haven't done sustainability before, it's okay if you already have your tree and haven't looked at the roots all the way yet. But as you start new things, as you get even applying for new grants, when you're even applying, you're thinking about how are you going to be able to sustain this? What is the future of this going to look like? Is this going to work for you? So I always say start planning now, and you can start doing it immediately, thinking about new things that you're thinking about implementing, changing your perspective from just trying to implement it to actually thinking about right away, how is this going to look like in 2 years? How is it going to look like in 5 years? And for our coalition, where we really started thinking about this, we were late to the game. This isn't something we started in 2004. Believe me, we were not thinking about sustainability. And we just wanted to make things happen. People wanted to get to work. So I get it. We were there too. And we got drug-free communities in 2009 for years 1 through 5, the Drug-Free Communities Grant. And we didn't start looking at sustainability to about year 4, and we should have started doing it sooner. To thinking about what if we didn't get year 6 through 10, and how can we make sure that we have the staff we need and the programs that are working. So we really started to delve into what works. So believe me, if you haven't started right away, we were there too. You know, learn by trial and error. But now as you start thinking about in this coming year what you are going to implement, or if you are state funded, thinking about as July 1 comes up and you know you're going to have those new plans, what does this really look like if you suddenly lost all your funding? What is it that you really need? What is really working? So begin every new implementation with the understanding of how that activity will be sustained. And I don't just mean, this is everything from billboards, like even thinking about your billboards, how are you going to maintain those? Compliance checks. So in staff, like thinking about every little thing and how you're going to continue to maintain it is important. I know a lot of us make big purchases, especially when we finally get our money, of whether it's copiers or things like that, and really thinking about, even when it comes to something as simple as a supply, like a copier or something, how are you going to continue to maintain that product, maintain that for the coalition, and what's best. And don't be afraid to cut what is not working, and we're going to go more into that. As coalitions, most of us are led, if not all, because we have a heart for it and because we want to change our communities. And sometimes it's hard when we have so many people dedicated, and there's a lot of people like that, to cut something that we've been doing for a really long time. But it's really important, and this is where it comes back to thinking like a business. If you're putting money into something that isn't really helping anyone anymore, you're actually wasting money that could be spent somewhere else where you could make real change. So I know you have all seen the SLOWEST model. I think I'm echoing. Is everyone having trouble? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, but you are echoing.
You did.
Is your computer volume on?
No, it's off.
Okay, if someone whose volume isn't muted, is your computer volume on?
Is this better?
I think it's because somebody is listening in and they haven't muted their phone.
Okay, can everyone mute their phone or their computer? Is that better? I'm going to text, please. Is that better? Are we good? I think that's better now. All right. Thank you, guys. I'm sorry about that. Okay, so I know that this is ad nauseum for some of you, and by raise of hands, how many are going to the Coalition Academy Tennessee is putting on in the next couple weeks with CADCA? Oh, a lot of you. Look at that. So I apologize. You're going to be oh, wow, a ton. Great. You guys are going to love it. But you will see so much of this, and I know some of you on there like Camilla have seen this, and Angie a lot, so I'm sorry that you keep seeing it. But going back to our treatment motto, it works if you work it. It is true. There's a reason this has existed for as long as it has, and it's helping coalitions and nonprofits across the country and actually across the world do what they're doing, is because if you use it correctly and if you use it every day, this really does help build a stronger, more effective organization. So the SPIF model is Strategic Prevention Framework Model, for those of you who may be brand new to coalition work. And so they call it the SPIF flower. And I'll tell them myself, because I know there is newbies in the group from what I could see, is my first day, everyone told me, I was a training for my first day of work with a bunch of coalitions from across the state who had already been in the process at least like 6 months longer than I had been. And I showed up at the training, and it was a big training with lots of other like treatment providers and stuff. So we were in our own room, and they're like, well, who are you with? And I was like, I'm with the prevention people. They're like, you're with SPIF. And they're like, just write it down on your card. And I was like, I don't know how to spell SPIF, like SPIFF. And they're like, no, like SPF. And I was like, yeah, that's sunscreen. I don't know what you people are talking about. So whenever I see that, just so you know, it is Strategic Prevention Framework Model. And I apologize if I ever have acronyms in here. I'm not saying please let me know, but I'll try to remember that. But using it, so it's the SPIF flowers, they call it, and it's assessment, capacity, planning, implementation, and evaluation. And then you're always thinking about sustainability and cultural competence. And what I put 1 through 3 here is that we're always to be thinking about, I think oftentimes we get stuck in a rut, and we think about this in terms of, okay, I'm going to assess my community, I'm going to do my, my student surveys, I'm going to figure out, I'm going to do some environmental scans, I'm going to find out that, kids in 8th grade are using more alcohol, and I'm going to find out they're getting it from retailers, and then we're going to do compliance checks, I'm going to plan that, and then we're going to do some implementation around it and then evaluate that. And they don't think about it in terms of you should be doing this at the program level, the organizational level, and the community level. So the community level is definitely like what I was just talking about. Like you're doing the you should be doing it at the program level, the organizational level, and the community level. So program is even thinking, okay, so now you're doing compliance checks because you're getting it from retailers. How are those compliance checks? Assess if those are working. What is your capacity around them? Planning those. How are you implementing those? Like everything from that. And then organizational level, assessing your actual meetings. Assessing if the structure you have is working. Do you really need 2 coordinators doing this? For us, we found out we had at one point a prevention coordinator, a youth coordinator, and a director. And we quickly discovered that our youth coordinator, that position wasn't working. And it wasn't because of the person in it, because we have had other people in it. It just wasn't what our coalition needed. And so now we have an outreach coordinator because that's really what needs to happen. So when you think about SPIF, yes, think about it in terms of globally for your community that you need to find out what the alcohol, tobacco, and drug rates are. But also think about it in terms of every individual thing you're implementing and what your organization is doing and taking you through that. It's really important on several levels. Okay, so talking about steps to sustainability. And this is hard. And I think, yes, every year we all look at our budgets because, if you're state funded, every, May and June you're submitting new budgets. And with DFC, you're looking at them now because you're submitting with drug-free communities. But you should be looking at your budgets yearly in a much more, not based on what your funder wants, but what's best for your community. And this is where, and obviously in your best case scenario, you want to have a couple board members, maybe your board chair and your treasurer and some coalition members and staff sitting down to really look at this over a few days. But for us, now we do it that way. But when it first started, it needed to get done because, like I said, we were in year 4 of DFC, moving into year 5 of drug-free communities, and I wanted to make sure that we were going to make it if we didn't get year 6. So I sat down with my staff, and we went through this in a way that made sense for us at the time. So I get it. Yes, in a perfect scenario, the way coalition work should work, we should be all working together. But I'm also a realist and realize sometimes you need to get this work done and you need to get done quickly. So getting all of your budget together and looking at those streams and where they fall, and start just making a list of activities and overhead. This really came about for us when we started working with community anti-drug coalitions across America when we were going after the Got Outcomes Award. We really just started looking at everything we were doing and whether or not it was working so that we could prove data-wise if we were really reducing the things we said we were reducing. And what it did was actually help us look at our budget and think about what needed to be sustained within it, because even though we were after why we were successful so that we could make sure that we were showing everything, it also showed us what we weren't being successful at, which is sometimes even more important. So it can just be a big whiteboard and getting, like I said, your staff and just listing everything that you're doing and what needs to be cut or what needs to be sustained. And we're going to go through an actual a tool at the end that is just a kind of rough outline to help you kind of think about that in a strategic way. And then which ones need to be sustained and why. And some of this is hard. Like I said, you want to be using data, and in the 3rd phase of this series, you will hear more about how you can use your data to decide this, because a lot of times what you'll realize as you talk to people is the reason you're continuing to do something is because you've always done it or because people believe in it, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's working. And then talking about planning immediate cuts or phase out, and then strategically planning how you can fund remaining activities and overhead now into the future. And like I said, I know that the basis of this webinar and why a lot of you are here to learn how to generate revenue for your coalition or nonprofit, and I get that. But you can't get to that place without thinking about a lot of these things first, which is why I really wanted to talk about this first so that we can get you to a place where you have a really sustainable budget and you can figure out how you can fit in what you're doing so well. You're going to figure that out from doing this, and then we can figure out how you can profit for what you're doing well. So I'm looking in the chat box. Hey, not sure why we do, but we have a big CLD board in our county, especially since, oh, Angie, thank you. Yes, there is more billboards. Yeah, that is, Angie was asking a question about a new billboard that's in her community for a prescription drug campaign, Count It, Lock It, Drop It, and why it's there because they're not paying for it. And they're not a hot spot, and that's because someone else funded that for you. And she says it looks nice, so thank you. And so then thinking about, so what I did, you're like, okay, so how do I look at my budgets? The easiest way, yes, you have tons of them. And what we've started to do every single year is break out our budgets into pie charts like this. Yes, the board gets the full budgets too. We talk about all of them. But there's visual people and there's people who, you know, everyone learns differently. And this was a really easy way to show. In 2014, 15, you could say like over half of that budget is drug-free communities. That's a problem. And what you really, as a visual person, what you want to do is start seeing all your pieces of your pie being equal. So if almost all your funding is just state funding, what happens when your funding is cut? Your ability to sustain isn't there. So how can you really make sure your pie has all the pieces equal so everyone's getting the same piece? And I'm working with another nonprofit that is not a coalition on this right now because they're almost completely community funded. They're receiving hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations from their community, but they're worried because it's from 4 or 5 huge donors that are in their community. And what happens if one of them stops donating? A huge chunk that's supporting their school will affect their ability to do their job. And so really what they're trying to do is get more like federal and state grants, but also more donations at smaller amounts, like $1 and $2 donations and $100 donations, instead of just having these huge, large ones, because that's what you want to get to, where you really have, if you're thinking about it in terms of a foundation of a house, you're supporting all the pillars and not just having a ton of money under one. And so this is just a great visual way of showing it to people and thinking about it in terms of yourself because you know where your money is. And you can break this down and say like 10% here and everything else, but being able to see it sometimes in this pie form and realize like, listen, we need to increase this area, and how can we do that really helps you strategically plan for the next year. So thinking about that, evaluating your funding stream, where's your funding coming from? And what I mean by that is, like I said, do you have state funding? Do you have federal funding? Do you have local foundation funding? Are you getting something from your fundraising? Like, are you doing fundraisers, and how much is that? And in-kind. And this is for 2 reasons. A, it helps you figure out, okay, if this grant's ending, and should we go after another federal grant because this federal grant's ending? Or do we need to increase our in-kind amount? Can we do a campaign throughout the year that's getting people to donate more? Do we need to go after more foundation money? It really gives you a way of seeing where you need to increase funding. And are your funding streams on the same timeline for completion, and what is the length of time? And I think this is really important because a lot of times we just start going after money to chase money because we're afraid of not happening it. And I think everyone would be lying if they say they have not been in those shoes before, because of course the last thing we want is our coalition's momentum to stop, especially after you've gotten it started. All of us know, have been there, that you're so afraid of it going away once you get the ball rolling, and funding can hinder that. So when I say this, for us, for example, Drug-Free Communities Grant and our state funding both fund alcohol. And there's only so much you can do around alcohol, particularly as a smaller community. And like I said, I'm that might be different if you're from a larger city. But for our small community, there's only so much we can do with alcohol, and we were very heavily funded for that. So going after something like the Sober Truth on Prevention grant that the drug-free community grantees can go after, which is only alcohol, didn't make sense for us at the time because we were already heavily funded for that. And it's hard to pass that up. It's hard to say, no, you know what, we don't need to apply for this. We need to wait because our funding for alcohol is going to end here, and this is going to be the time. And yes, you're taking a risk because it might get cut from the budget, the federal budget. But at the same time, it's not only whether or not you're heavily funded for it, but do you need to spend more staff time on that when you have other more pressing issues, when you look at things like prescription drugs or meth, amphetamine, and things like that? Do you need to be spending more staff time on that? And since the upcoming funding that we're seeing from the CARA Act, is it the right time for your coalition to apply for it? Like for the prescription drugs, are you heavily funded for prescription drugs? So really thinking about the timeline for the completion and the length of time so that you're overlapping your funding but not on top of it. So it's not like you have 4 years of funding for alcohol and 5 more years and only 1 year is actually not overlapping. What you want to kind of do is have years, 5 years of funding for one and 5 for the other, and only have that last year overlapping. That way you're extending what you could do, and that takes planning outside. Like I said, we made that decision on STOP 4 years ago. So now as we're coming up, because our drug-free communities grant will be ending, this, when it comes up again, we will be applying for it because we will see that we'll be losing money in the future with drug-free communities. So it does take planning farther out. Important notes on funding. Like I said, don't chase money, just chase money. And it's hard to do when you're in a position where you think you're about to lose everything. Like I said, we've been there. Anyone who's been DFC, drug-free communities, years 1 through 5, and is in years 1 through 5, has felt that feeling. The best thing you can do is to stay on mission and plan. And that doesn't mean that you can't expand. And I want to talk about this for a moment because I feel like a lot of times people are like, okay, so I can't do anything outside the box. And what I say is, like, if you saw when we went back to evaluating funding streams, I'm going to just click back to this. If you look over to your right to the proposed, one of the things you see is veteran funding. In our community, we have an Air Force base and a strong National Guard community. And so we started working with our veterans on drug and alcohol issues. So we're still staying on mission, but at the same time expanding the cradle-to-grave aspect of drug and alcohol prevention by starting to work with a different population in a different way. Or, for example, we started looking at suicide rates. Well, just going after suicide money doesn't make sense for a nonprofit coalition because that's not our expertise. But what we started to look at was that we had our 10th and 12th grade girls having, in the last 2 weeks, very high averages of thinking about suicide in the last 2 weeks. On top of that, we saw them increasing the female amount rate use with prescription drugs as alcohol was creeping up to matching males. And in fact, in prescription drugs, it was matching males with, historically, males are more risk takers, and you'll see their levels mostly always higher than females. And we started to see them equaling out. And that when we looked into the prescription drug issue, that there's a lot of self-medicating for issues like anxiety and depression. And so we could link the fact that we're having these high suicide rates among our 10th and 12th grade girls, and it's looking like a mental health issue. And this keeps us, on task for our mission because we're drug and alcohol devoted, but allowing us to expand to, work with new people in a new way for funding, thinking about bringing in some mental health people into the schools, talking about bringing in suicide prevention and going after additional monies, but it is staying on plan. You're not just like, we're going to do suicide prevention now and running after money. It still needs to be rooted in the cause, so staying on mission and plan. And again, overlapping funding stream timelines, but not piling it on top of each other so that you're extending your ability to do funding. Okay, before I move on to the next one, because of the, and I'm sorry, I have my cold is acting up. I just need to take a drink. The next slide with this system we're using, the PowerPoint did allow me to do the kind of phases I wanted to do to kind of talk about the budget busters in a way that we could click. So before I show you the slide, I just want to ask, so this is where we can be interactive. If you could put in the chat, or Leah, if you could open up discussion so that they can say it on the phone. But what do you think the top budget busters are for your budget? And when I say budget buster, that doesn't mean that they're not worth it. I think when I say budget buster, a lot of people are thinking about stuff that you should cut because it just doesn't work and it sucks. What I'm just talking about is what in your budget costs you the most money, and so it makes the most sense for you to be looking at those to make sure they're working and being effective for you. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I'm really looking at. So in your chat or in discussion, if we can open. Oh, okay. So maybe we shouldn't do that, Leah. Sorry. So why don't you go ahead and put in the chat box, and I'll read them out as people go, and we can talk about, like I said, looking for budget busters, things, like I said, they're not necessarily not helpful or not that you don't need, but it costs you the most money. So it looks like we have lock boxes, media, salaries, all of which these are true, billboards, lock boxes again, media. Anyone else? What's something else? Payroll, travel costs for trainings, very good. There's only one that hasn't been mentioned, and we're going to go ahead and click, and that's enforcement. Your enforcement costs, if anyone helps pay for compliance checks. Hand raised, who helps pay for enforcement costs, like either compliance checks or sobriety checkpoints? See how many of those we have. Okay, so there's 3. Okay. Either everyone else fell asleep or only 3 actually pay for it. But so top budget busters, yes. First and foremost is staff. Obviously is the top of everyone's list of money. I would be surprised if that wasn't what everyone's top cost was. And I say T-shirts, but really what we're talking about are campaign items in general. And I just want to, yeah, okay. Enforcement, and again, we're talking about compliance checks, sobriety checkpoints. And like I said, that doesn't mean it's not necessary, it's just a higher cost. Media, and that I would include billboards, PSAs on the radio and TV, that kind of thing. Training, travel, yes, particularly for those of you, God love you, who live in the East and West Tennessee and have to make all those trips into Nashville. I feel for you, that definitely is where your higher training and travel costs. And then, of course, overhead, office space, equipment, that sort of thing. How many of you, by raise of hands, pay for your office space? Okay, it's a lot more than I thought. Quite a few of you. And there's nothing wrong with that. We still pay for a portion of our office space. I was just wondering. And we'll talk about leveraging some of those opportunities to leverage as we go forward with that. So talking about budget busters, and I'm sorry that slide's a little off right there. When I'm talking about, I'm going to give some examples, but one of the caveats I want to say before we move forward is that what you need to remember is every coalition community is different, as you all know. Some of us are from very small rural communities, others are from big cities, and what you should cut from one community doesn't necessarily mean you should cut from another community, because it's about what is working and looking at your data and figuring out what works for your coalition and why you're doing it. So the reasons why we cut something might not work for your community. So as I give some examples of some things we cut, do not feel like I'm saying like you should not be doing this, it's awful work. It really is about what works for you. There's no one size fits all. That's why it's important to look at your own information and data. So staff, and as I mentioned before, for us, as we were going in and thinking about what staff was working and what was worth maintaining, and if we lost all our funding tomorrow, what staff was needed in order to make the coalition work. The youth coordinator for us was not working. And what we needed in order to be more sustainable was someone who was just in charge of doing outreach, going and doing the presentations at Kiwanis clubs and Lion clubs, and the person who was in charge of social media, and a person who could really be the link between some of the general community and the coalition for two reasons. So that the director and the prevention coordinator could really be doing the implementation work, but also so that we were getting an increase in in-kinds and donations and really making more of a name for ourselves in that way, because we had never, and I think a lot of coalitions and nonprofits struggle with this, we were so into the work and we were well funded by the state and federal grants that we had that we weren't great at asking for money. And so this was a way of us putting in a new sustainability component. So really thinking about what works with staff. And then for us, I put T-shirts in here, and that's kind of an inside joke for our coalition is this what goes back to what works for in the beginning. We've all done what they call low-hanging fruit, something that is super easy, that's an easy win for your coalition. And for us it was to get the schools involved, they really wanted T-shirts. We have, in a small community, we have 3 school systems because we're crazy and we have little fiefdoms. And they wanted T-shirts with messaging on them. And so we started doing that one of our first years. And we kept doing it because they liked it. And we needed it that first year to get them on board and engaged in some way. But then it got to the point that it wasn't doing anything and we weren't making any changes. We weren't actually seeing, we needed something more than just a T-shirt. We needed a campaign all year long, which is what we ended up building it into, that every 3 months we changed out kind of, it was the same idea, but the posters and the information in the classrooms. But the T-shirts couldn't be, we were wasting a lot of money and not getting anything out of it. So for us, it was really looking at those campaign items that were worth it. Enforcement, going back to, and this is where you'll hear a lot with coalition work, the whack-a-mole approach. And that happens a lot with compliance checks, I think. Like for us, we started doing them, we have our rates in a really good place, and then we want to stop funding them, and so the rates go back up. So finding a way in between, you don't want to keep funding something once the rates go down to the same level, but finding a way in between of making that work. So looking at enforcement, and then of course media. For us, we immediately cut billboards. We're a small community, we were wasting a lot of money and actually time because we had a horrible contract. So it made the most sense for us to cut billboards, and we did so, and we haven't gone back to them. Now, a lot of communities get free billboards, totally, like that works. Where we've gotten them, we've done it. But for us in our small community, we were surveying consistently on the 2 topics that we had billboards on, and no one was saying they saw it from the billboards. Every time they were hearing it from the radio or from the newspaper. So it didn't make sense for us to be spending that money. Training and travel, of course, thinking about what's really necessary, and then I think ordering too much stock is out there because I will tell on us. We order those age calendars for tobacco and alcohol places, and there was one year that we ordered them and did not get them out, and you can't do anything with 2014 calendars in 2015. So making sure that you're ordering the amount you need and you're getting it out immediately so you're not wasting that is important. So this is when you gotta love you gotta know when to hold them, know when to fold them. This goes back to effectiveness and cost and thinking about what's working. And this goes back to when we get to this next part 2 next week of finding out what your coalition or nonprofit's doing well so that you can market and sell it. When you're figuring that out, you're going to first, like I said, find out what's not working and what is working first. So we're going back and forth. So you got to know what to cut and phase out, leverage, find additional funding, or keep funding. And so what I mean by that is, going back to compliance checks, I'm going to use that. If it's working, like ours were, why are you the only one funding it? So if it's that successful, what we did is go to our beer board and everything and say, yeah, it's working great. There's other things that need to go down. Can you do a percentage of this? Can you start paying for a certain amount of this? Is there another person you can work with? Because if it's great, you shouldn't be the only one funding it. And if it's not successful, why are you funding it? Why are you the only one funding it? So, and then talking about leveraging, and that goes back to your partnerships when I was talking about that we were seeing an issue with suicide and prescription drugs among our females. Talking about then leveraging, can suicide come in there? Do we have to actually pay for that program? We can have suicide prevention come in and maybe center stone for mental health. If it is working but you're about to lose money, how can you find additional funding, or how can you keep funding? And that's where that keep funding or find additional funding area, when you look through, that's what we're really talking about, like once you have something great that you can market and generate revenue, that you could put that back into something you're trying to really fund. And I'm going to skip forward to show you the sustainability tool real fast, because this will go to this. Like I said, this is just, and Leah could send you the PDF on it. As you're looking at individual things like compliance checks, you would ask yourself, like the budget items compliance checks, is it necessary is your first question. Does it build capacity? Is it evidence-based or preventative in nature? And does it fit into the mission of your organization? Like, is it working? Do you have people on board? So yes or no. And so then is it working? Is it effective? And then it kind of shows you, you could follow the flow chart down as you look at each individual thing, whether it's staff, compliance checks, media, any of those things, so you could really follow. I know it looks like craziness, but you could really look through and kind of go through each activity to figure out, okay, do I need to keep funding it or seek a different funding or leverage resources to continue this activity? Do I need to cut it immediately? Like I said, for us, the billboards were cut immediately. It was like, once that contract was over, let's cut. If there is a possibility you don't know, and there were some of the things that we had come up, like, for instance, a transitional academy or some of the stuff we were doing in the high schools, like, we need to go back and figure out if this is working or not. And let's see, let me go back. Sorry, I jumped forward so I could do that. Okay, so the next thing kind of want to talk about is leveraging the top items to leverage. And when I say leverage is how can you, if you have something great but not the amount of money to fund it, or you just want to be more sustainable so you want more people involved, what are some of the top items that you could leverage? Or work with another nonprofit, work with your police department where they could pay for certain portions or even give money for it or their time. So what are some items that you could actually leverage? And for instance, one of the things you could leverage is money. I'll put that one out there. But if you put in the little chat box, what are some other things you could leverage in order to keep something going? Manpower? Great. Thank you, Lord. Office space? That's great, Jenny. Media match? Awesome. Is there anyone else? Okay, and training, very good. And that's what, as you'll see, and like I said, time, talent, this is all put, everything you put is above this. But yes, money, talent, definitely. When we were originally worried about getting year 6 through 10 of drug-free communities, I reached out to our Child Advocacy Center, who was across the street from us, and said, listen, the odds of us losing this position are high if we don't get this funding. Is there any way we could share a position, an administrative position between the two of us, because they were having some money issues at the time. So thinking about things like that, is there a way that you could share even talent with someone? Relationships is another great one, and partnerships. Exactly. Relationships are a huge thing that you could leverage. Goods, whether it's everyone going in on a T-shirt or people. We had office space. We immediately were spending too much on office space, so we found a space that was cheaper, that we went from paying $1,500 to $500 and have twice as much space, and we were able to allow other nonprofits to be in there so we could share everything from a copier if we needed to, or any of those things. Access to free training locations, having those, leveraging partnerships so you have access to, we have lots of free training spaces. And services, again, a lot of this is going back to your capacity building and what you could do with services, and making sure you're talking to the people within your community about what you can bring in. For us, we had moral recognition therapy, or MRT. We wanted to put it into our alternative schools. It's a costly program in terms of training to get the original training. We worked with our drug court, who already had a master trainer that we found out on their staff. We talked to them, and just because we partnered several times, they allowed her to spend 2 days a week in our alternative school putting that on. And so we just had to find the funding to pay for the workbooks, which we were able to go to the business community. And for 2 years in a row, the Chamber of Commerce put on fundraisers, just getting them to donate things for the token economy, like awards, like free gift certificates, but also money so that we could buy those handbooks. And so we actually didn't put any of our own money into that because we leveraged several of those opportunities. And then we did apply for some foundational monies to train teachers and, school counselors in every one of our middle and high schools so that they can continue that in a sustainable way within it. And then we're just trying to fund books. And a lot of those schools leverage what they had to buy handbooks. So it really is about, you could do a whole preventative program like moral recognition therapy, which is evidence-based, and not have to pay a dime if you leverage correctly. Okay, so I know we're getting towards the end. So I know this is the cover of a book, and it looks a little crazy. I truly recommend you reading it, and this comes from my father has talked about reading this book several times, and it was one of those things, like he was a nuclear engineer who was an Air Force officer who did systems management. So getting a daughter that wanted to be a psych major in nonprofit work, at first I think he was leery. But now we've realized as we've gone forward how much it actually does overlap. And then I have my husband was a business major, and he had to read this book. So between the two of them, I was like bullied into reading this book, but it was a good idea. And there's over 3 million copies sold for a reason, and it was back in the 70s, so you'll see the covers a little, old school. But I fully recommend reading it. It is a business book, and it looks super boring, but I promise it's not. They do it in a very relationship way. You're actually following a guy through his work, and it reads like any normal book would read, but you're getting a lot of great business from it. But the gist of it is, when you're looking in the beginning, when I told you to write down everything that you're doing, one of the things you have to look at is what is holding you back. Are you spending a lot of your time and effort on something that isn't getting you anywhere? And that's really what your bottleneck is. And I think all of us has done that at some point. Our sobriety checkpoints were that for us. We started funding them under the Strategic Prevention Framework State Incentive Grant when I first started. And we were getting data from it, but we weren't ever actually looking at our data, and we kept funding it. And we were spending time on it, but we weren't actually figuring out if it was working. And that was our fault. So we had to figure out what we were doing. And why it says, do you have your fastest lead or your slowest, is because a lot of times we're so worried about how much momentum that we just keep going, and so we have the fastest thing out there, and that's great, but you're getting the stuff that you're working on that wasn't working farther and farther behind. And so you actually need to flip it and put your slowest front. And this comes from, the best way to say it is, it was a Boy Scout troop, and you'll read about it in the book if you read the book. And you have one kid that isn't as athletically inclined as the other, and so they have all the kids, they're strongest out front. Well, they're running up the mountain, and the one that isn't as athletically inclined is all the way in the back, and so you have these huge spaces in between your troops. And what they had to do was flip it to have him in the front, because they motivated and helped him and moved him up the mountain, and then you have everyone close and condensed in the team together. And that's how you have to think about the activities you're doing. If you just have all your great things running ahead, you keep forgetting about the time and the money you're spending on some of the stuff that isn't working. And you flip it to force yourself to spend the time up front on some of the stuff that's taking you and that you're in denial about that isn't working. Get that fixed, then you have like a great running machine. You don't have those bottlenecks. And then, like, talking about adapting, the book talks a ton about making sure, even when something works, that you keep adapting it. And for us, for instance, like count it, walk it, drop it, we've been doing for quite a few years now. We have to look at it in terms of heroin prevention now as well, and how can we grow and adapt this? Or if something isn't working anymore, like for instance, Karen from Knox called because one of the items doesn't work for her, so they want to do something with prescription drug bags. That's something that we have to think about and constantly adapt, and don't get stuck in being defensive over something we've done before because it worked, continuing to see if it works. And then if you look in business, there's always plateaus, and that's when, again, you need to look at whether now it's something, even though it worked before, that you need to cut, or if you need to change it and adapt it in order to keep moving. So I recommend reading that book. It was awesome, and it has really helped us look at what's working and not working in a business sense for us. Okay, so talking about homework, I told you. Taking off your nonprofit hat and putting on your business hat for part 2, because we're really going to be delving into taking what you've learned here, so that this next part, in part 2, we can really look at, okay, what is working, in your community, and what can we take and trademark, produce, copyright, or do whatever we need to do in a different way so you can generate funding. But first we have to figure out what's really working for your coalition or nonprofit. So kind of, like I said, you're not graded. This is just so you come back to part 2 ready, is to review your budget and action plans and think what are items that could be reduced, leveraged, or cut, and why? And what are 3 successes, example like particular initiatives, structure changes, etc., and why? And Leah will email you out the PowerPoint and the sustainability tool so you can kind of work through some of that. But like I said, that will end up coming back for part 2 so we can really look at what has been working for your coalition and what we can take to the next level, hopefully, so that you can find new ways of generating revenue. And it might not be selling a product or copywriting a product. It might be a new way you can partner or new funding streams you can go after. So it really is open, but it would help if you come back with some of those ideas in your head so that as we're talking about it, you can really get the most out of the part 2 webinar. And then, so part 2 is January 12th at the same time. Like I said, Christina and Merino will be joining us for that next session. And then section 3 is really about evaluation. And so if you're having trouble figuring out what is working and not working, we're going to have 2 teams of experts come in and kind of talk about data and how to really make your coalition as productive as possible and look at your individual activities. So please join us for part 3 as well. And then Leah, if you want to open it up to questions.
Yes. Also, I just put in the chat box my email address. If you do need a certificate, remember to email me, and I'll get your certificate right to you. And I'll also send out the worksheet to everyone, and you'll be getting the feedback survey as well following this call. So does anybody have any questions for Christina or I? Okay, great.
Okay, well,
good back in our chat box, so that's great.
Yeah, and if anything comes up, like I said, you can email me or Leah, and we'll get those questions answered for you. And like I said, please join us for part 2 so we can really delve into how you can make some more money for your coalition, because I'd love to assist in any way we can. And thank you, Leah, and for Pat for allowing this webinar to be accessible to all of our members. I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yes, and feel free to share the registration link for the next 2 with whoever you think would benefit from it as well. So,
thank you, everyone, and have a great 2017.
Bye.